Hi everyone, welcome to the December 18th edition of the TimeformUS Forecast. I'm David Aragone, and I'll be joined just in a moment by my co-host Craig Milkowski. This week on the podcast, we're going to do some handicapping at Fairgrounds and Gulfstream Park. There's Saturday cards at the Fairgrounds. They have 4 stakes races that we're going to talk about. The Richard Scherer Memorial, the Buddy Diliberto Memorial, the Blushing KD, and then their final race of the day, the Tenacious, which features the return of an exciting 3-year-old Maxfield, one who's still undefeated, but we've only seen a few times, so we'll talk about his chances once we get to that. Then we'll move on to Gulfstream Park, where they're running the Via Borghese and one of the only graded stakes races this weekend, the Grade 3 Mr. Prospector, which has attracted a large competitive field of sprinters, including some horses that are coming out of the Breeders' Cup Sprint, so we'll get to that at the very end of the podcast. But Craig, we're going to start things out at the Fairgrounds, and it's a pretty interesting group of races. We got 3 races on the turf, actually, and then that dirt race featuring Maxfield.
Yeah, it's quite a card. I wish they'd laid it out a little differently. All the stakes have maiden races in between them, so that's kind of going to limit my pick 4, pick 5 plays. But I'm okay with that because, I'm more of a vertical player anyway. And some good deep fields and a place this time of year, I tend to focus on the Fairgrounds. I think it's a really good betting product. Usually get some big fields, and they have a really nice series of races that kind of build up to their big Louisiana Derby day, and not just for the 3-year-olds, for all the different divisions. So that's why I really kind of like the way they lay out their schedule.
I agree with that. The Fairgrounds is not always a track that I handicap a lot, but I had some fun when we were talking about these races, especially last winter. It seemed like a lot of these races drew competitive fields, and that's certainly starting off with this first big card that they have of the winter. And we're going to begin with the 7th race, that Richard Scherer Memorial. This one's going 5.5 furlongs on the turf, and it's drawn a pretty interesting field here. I'm not sure exactly where the public's going to go. I know the slight favorite on the morning line is Archidust. We'll see how much money he takes. It seems like he's maybe not in the best form that he once was. But I think pace could have a lot to do with the outcome of this race because there's a limited amount of speed signed on for a turf sprint.
Yeah, you don't normally see a pace projector for this in a 5.5 furlong turf sprint, particularly with a field of 11. But we show Hollis, the 4-horse, who's 5-1 on the morning line with just a clear, easy lead. And he's a horse who's run some big races on turf, particularly that one on Preakness weekend a couple races back, where he just blitzed the field early and was able to hold on albeit over a yielding course. But for me, as a vertical player, I'm glad this isn't a race I'd have to use horizontal, because for me, it's either going to come down to single Hollis or have to go really deep, because I think there's several other alternatives. But looking at this race vertically, I'm going to go with Hollis and hope he can transfer that form to firm turf, which he has won on before. He seems like a new horse since I think he was gelded a little while back, if memory serves. And I know there were some trainer changes, but he just has looked like a new horse, and I just think that speed advantage is going to be tough to overcome.
Yeah, Hollis was a horse that I really didn't know what to do with in this race, because obviously if he runs back to that turf sprint at Pimlico 2 back, he's going to be pretty tough for this field to beat, because he showed excellent speed that day and just kept going to hold on. I'm not really sure where that came from, because his prior turf efforts, they honestly don't even make him a contender in this race. Was it the softer turf course that he encountered at Pimlico? Because they did get a lot of rain that weekend, and it wasn't the boggy kind of course that we've seen in Preakness's past, but there still was plenty of give to that course at Pimlico. And he also handled, or I should say, somewhat handled a course that was listed at soft at Ellis Park prior to that, when he ran his previous best on the turf. So I'm just not really sure what we're going to get from Hollis in this race. And I also think he could have to deal with the number 6 Just Might on the front end. I know the pace projector indicates that Hollis is going to be all alone, but I've got to think they're going to look to get Just Might forward, because he's run his best races when he's up close to the pace, either on the lead himself or contesting it. And I'm going to throw out his Breeders' Cup turf sprint last time, because he just never got near the lead that day, and he was never going to be successful coming from off the pace. Prior to that, he ran pretty well against better horses in the Woodford, and if he repeats that kind of effort, I think he's going to be a real rival for Hollis. Then obviously potentially he's the horse to beat if he gets the right kind of trip in here. So I would lean towards Just Might among those 2 speed horses, but there are definitely others to consider. One horse that I find pretty interesting is the number 2 Guildsman. He's a 3-year-old stepping up against older horses here. It says in the comment line block stretch last time. I wouldn't so much get caught up in that because he did encounter a little traffic around the far turn, but he got clear in the stretch. I think the biggest issue for him in the Arctic last time was that there was just no pace on, and it was a race that was dominated on the front end. They walked up front and sprinted home, and he really just couldn't make up any ground, as nobody could from the back of the pack in that race. He had been steadily improving throughout the summer prior to that as a 3-year-old, and I think if he continues on that trajectory, he could be a horse that runs well here at a bit of a price.
Yeah, and even you say he was improving before that. I mean, his figure still improved in that race. And it was definitely a race where we had all the fractions color-coded in blue and nobody was able to make up any ground, even in that long stretch at Woodbine. So I've got no problem with him. He's definitely one of the contenders I would talk about if I look beyond Hollis. A couple others are Real News, who it just seems to be a horse that always has a tough time getting position. It's probably not going to get any better for him if the field bunches up with the pace slow. And a horse that I always think runs well also is Fast Boat, especially since he moved to the Joe Sharp barn. He's been pretty solid for him as of late, and he's another one though that's going to have to work out a trip.
Yeah, Fast Boat is a horse that definitely scares me in here. If he runs back to that allowance win at Churchill back in June, when he won off by nearly 5 lengths, he's going to be tough for this field to beat. He's probably going to get to the winner's circle if he repeats that performance. But his surrounding efforts, they don't quite stack up to that, and he's kind of run by appointment only recently. He's got a few layoffs to deal with, so I know he's a horse that's had some physical infirmities in the past, so you kind of wonder if he can keep coming back in the best form. But I agree, at his best, he's a horse that's very dangerous in here. Moving on to the 9th race as we skip 2 races ahead, and we'll continue with that pattern as you mentioned. These stakes races are not consecutive, but the next stakes race on this Fairground Saturday card is the Diliberto Memorial. This one's going 1 mile and a 16th on the turf course for the older horses, and it's a pretty high quality field for a $75,000 stakes race. We've got plenty of horses with graded stakes form, including Cross Border, who was second in the Sword Dancer, a grade 1 over the summer, got put up to win the grade 2 Bowling Green at Saratoga. Those races are going marathon distances, and now he's cutting back to go 1 mile and a 16th as he did in the Mohawk last time and facing New York breds. He's kind of the horse to beat from a class standpoint, but I do kind of wonder if maybe he's tailing off a little bit.
Yeah, this is a strong race for just a $75,000 listed stake. We have a race rating for it of 124, which, I mean, that's a grade 3 borderline grade 2 type of number that we usually see. So it obviously drew a strong field. And a lot of that, there's 4 horses who pretty consistently run in the 120 or higher range. And that includes Cross Border. It includes Dot Matrix. And there's also Sailing Solo and Spectacular Gem. Now, this is a race the pace projector has set up. It thinks the pace is going to be fast. And in large part, that's because of Sailing Solo and Spectacular Gem. They're 2 horses, especially Sailing Solo, who really like to go to the front end and just see how far they can go. I think Sailing Solo's won 3 in a row that way, all with, averaging about a 120 speed figure. Spectacular Gem, he's going to have to get used early from that outside post position, assuming that the field stays intact. So I don't really have any problem with that fast pace designation. I don't think it'll be crazy fast, but I do think those 2 are going to have to work and maybe damage each other. So for me, it comes down to the other 2, Cross Border and Dot Matrix, and they actually raced against each other last time. And even though Cross Border finished ahead of them, and when they finished behind some like at Hot Brown that day, I prefer Dot Matrix in here. I just didn't love his trip that day. Some like it Hot Brown was kind of up there with a long shot whose name I forget, and that one just kind of backed out of it, and it left Dot Matrix and Jose Lezcano in a kind of unenviable position of chasing the favorite that day, who had pretty much things his own way. And it looked like he made a nice run, but I think it just got to him late, having to move early, move a little bit wide. So I prefer him of the 4 I've mentioned, and he would be my top pick in here.
Yeah, I think both of those New York Reds are pretty dangerous in here. Yeah, I didn't love Dot Matrix's trick last time either. He was kind of aggressively used away from the gate as if Jose Lascano had intentions to get to the front end, and that was just never happening with some like Hot Brown and Rinaldi, that other speed horse in the race. They're more front running types, and once he got Dot Matrix geared up, he kind of suddenly had to grab him as those horses came over, and the horse basically overreacted to that. The difference in the way that he was being ridden over the first eighth of a mile, whereas he was ridden and then suddenly grabbed and he was throwing his head about for the first quarter mile of the race. So I just think that maybe detracted from his finish a little bit. And yeah, he did get run down by Cross Border at the very end of the race. I didn't love Cross Border's effort there, though. To me, it just looked like Cross Border was never really in the race. He wasn't really going anywhere. He was trying to lug in at the top of the stretch when Jose Ortiz was getting into him. And yeah, he picked up third late, but to me, it was a pretty non-threatening third. And I just wonder if Cross Border is a horse that really got geared up to run some big races over the summer and responded so well to going those longer distances. And it feels to me like maybe he's tailed off a little bit, whereas maybe Dot Matrix is just kind of holding steady. So I think they're both dangerous in here, and they could be the top two choices. We'll see how they bet this race. I am interested, though, in that one speed horse that you mentioned, or I should say one of the two speed horses, the number 5 Sailing Solo. Well, we've got to see if he can translate that Gulfstream Park form to the fairgrounds. I know he's run well at the fairgrounds before, but it seemed like he kind of attained a new level of performance at Gulfstream this summer. But he was really good for those summer months. I mean, he got a pretty soft pace scenario last time in that Mr. Steele, when he just kind of got to walk along on the front end through moderate fractions and the field bunched up behind him and nobody could make up any ground. But his race 2 back I was more impressed by because he got plenty of early pressure that day. I know the pace is not color-coded in red in RPPs, but that was a race where if you look at the charts, anybody was up close to him early, they just faded away, and it was a race behind him that was dominated by closers, and he just ran away from that field anyway. That was a very strong performance from this horse, and to me, it just feels like he's a much better horse than he was when he was running in similar races at the fairgrounds last winter. I know there's other speed from Spectacular Gem, but he's really the only horse that can apply pressure, and I think it's just going to be up to James Graham on Spectacular Gem to decide if he's going to go after Sailing Solo and maybe cause them both to lose, or if he's going to try to sit second and maybe just run by him in the stretch. If he doesn't apply that pressure, I think it makes Sailing Solo really dangerous, and he might just be the best horse in this race.
Yeah, I have no problem with that selection at all. I could easily see that scenario unfolding where, as you said, there's not a ton of speed in here outside of Sailing Solo. So Spectacular Gem, maybe he gets over pretty easily and just sits off his flank. And if that did play out, I would probably still prefer Sailing Solo because, as you said, he's run some really impressive races. The speed figures say he's a strong contender in here, and I've got no real knocks on him whatsoever.
Let's fast forward 2 races again to the 11th race on this Fairground Saturday card, the Blushing KD, again going a mile and the 16th on the turf, but this time for the fillies and mares. This one did not come up quite as strong as the race we just discussed for the males, but we've got a couple of classy runners in here in the number 3 Dolica and the number 8 Secret Message. I think the interesting thing with Secret Message, who's the morning line favorite, is that she's going out for new connections. She's now with Brad Cox. She was a purchase at, I believe, the Keeneland November sale. She went for over $600,000, which is no surprise. She's a horse that has some graded stakes placing. She's got broodmare potential. No, not a big shock that she went for that sum of money, but they're going to continue racing her for a little while. The thing with her, though, is she was off form when we last saw her, and I think we've got to see if she can get back on track for Brad Cox.
Yeah, I mean, I think you have to give some extra credit for Brad Cox, which seems funny to say when the horse was trained by Graham Motion, but he seems to move up everything these days. But I agree with you at a short price. I don't think that's something I want to take a shot on. She hadn't looked too good since winning that race at Churchill at huge odds. I think it was the Mint Julep. She's just kind of been plodding around and picked up a couple pieces here and there, but never looked like a winner in any of them. So I'm not too excited about her. And Dolica is another. She's 3-1 on the morning line, second choice. She's She's just looked okay to me, but she hasn't run any great speed figures that make me jump up and say, I want to bet her at 5-2 or less or whatever she's going to be in here. So she didn't excite me. So for that reason, I went in a different direction, and that was just to her inside. I like Temple City Terror in here. She's 4-year-old filly who was really coming to her own at the end of last year. She had run some big figures in a couple of allowance races, and she took some time off, and she showed back up just, I think it was about 3 weeks ago, 2.5 weeks ago. And though her speed figure was only a 112, I really liked how she won that race. There wasn't a whole lot of pace on. We don't have it coded in blue. It wasn't that slow, but the race was gradually getting quicker throughout from a pace figure perspective. And she was able to rally from absolutely last on the turn to get up and win. So I liked what she saw, and I think there's more in the tank for her. And in a race like this, I want to take a shot with the price, and she's the one that I landed on.
Well, I think we can wrap this one up pretty quickly because we're in complete agreement in this race. I also thought that Temple City Terror was the interesting price horse. I'm a little skeptical we're going to get that 12-1 that she has on the morning line because I think she offers more appeal than that. But I think she is the right alternative to those two favorites. I have a little to add to what you said about Dolica and Secret Message. I'm not thrilled with the recent form of either one. And Temple City Terror, she just looked like a horse that was moving in the right direction over the summer, going back to last spring, and her return from the layoff was just okay, but she's got a right to move forward again. And I just think that she might be the horse with upside in here.
I did want to ask you about Beautiful Trauma. Do you think there's any turf breeding there? She tries it for the first time. I was wondering how many Pink fans are going to put money on her and drive her price down as well.
I was wondering if maybe she was in this race as almost like a somewhat MTO if this race potentially came off, because there is some rain predicted late in the day on Saturday. I think we'll get these turf races in, no problem. But I was looking at the forecast, and maybe that's what Tom Amoss is thinking, because she really doesn't have much turf pedigree at all. She'll be in front here because she's got plenty of early speed. It's just kind of a weird spot for her. Let's wrap things up at the fairgrounds with the final race on their Saturday card, the 13th. It's the Tenacious, another $75,000 stakes. This one going 1.16 miles on the dirt course. And as I mentioned at the top of the show, this one features a horse that I think a lot of people are looking forward to returning. That's the number 6 Maxfield, who, of course, is the morning line favorite. He's undefeated in his 3 career starts. He was on the Kentucky Derby trail when that one was rescheduled over the summer. He won that prep, the Matt win, very impressively back in May. But he's a horse that's had trouble staying on the racetrack. He's had a number of layoffs in his career, so now he's returning again from another layoff. And we'll see what we get if he's ready to fire a top effort. Though, against the field that he's facing here, he probably doesn't need to.
Yeah, this is a race normally in a spot like this. I'd want to take a shot against Maxfield, but it's just really hard for me to get excited about anyone else in here. He did run a 119 TimeformUS speed figure in the Matt win, which is probably good enough to win in this spot. And, that happened over 6 months ago. So he's a 3-year-old. If he's ready to roll, I would expect even better numbers out of him. So I just think he's going to be really hard to beat. And I'd make him my top pick, but it's a race that very likely I'm not going to bet. What I would hope for as a bettor personally is that he runs a really visually impressive race and it comes back like a 112 and he gets bet heavily in the Pegasus. But we'll just see what happens here. Some others that I looked at were Sonneman. He has a big figure for me last time out at Churchill. I did look over that card again because frankly the run backs haven't been all that strong from it. But it doesn't seem like too tough of a day to make figures. I don't know if it was the figure. Maybe he just was helped by the really slow pace that day. He was up close to it, was able to finish strong. But he's probably the horse most likely to beat him. But I can't get excited about him at 3-1. And the pace projector points to Cool Bobby. Our power picks actually have him picked second, largely in part because he's shown on an easy early lead, clear from the rail. But he just doesn't have the figures for me to win a race like this. So I'm just mostly going to watch this as a fan, see how Maxfield does, and then look forward to making that speed figure later in the evening and seeing how it turns out.
Yeah, Maxfield's definitely the horse to beat. And if he runs merely as well as he did in the Matt win, I guess he's probably going to beat this field. But he does have questions to answer. I mean, this is a horse who's had some physical issues, and you wonder if they can keep coming back as the same horse. Obviously, the connections remain pretty high on him, so you got to take that into consideration. But he's going to be a very short price in this race, and I do think Sonneman's a real rival for him. They seem like the right two horses. They're both 3-year-olds that seem to have upside, and Sonneman just has that recency advantage. And, you could say, where did that last speed figure come from? Which is fair because, as you said, horses from that race have not exactly come back and distinguished themselves. But let's keep in mind, he won by almost 6 lengths, and he absolutely destroyed that field. So how much does it matter if nobody was really close to him at the end? And I mean, that was a slow pace, and he was off the slow pace, and he rallied past those horses and just sprinted away from them in the stretch. So it seems like that was a legitimate performance, and it's not like it came out of nowhere because he was cycling up to that kind of effort previous to that. The horse that beat McKeenland in his prior start, Big Dreaming, he seems like a very promising horse that's run on both turf and dirt, but obviously has a ton of talent. And prior to that, I know he was a big price in that Pat Day Mile, but he ran well to be second there behind Rushy, closing into a moderate pace. So it just seems like Sonneman is a horse that's kind of figured things out for Steve Asmussen. And if he continues on this current trajectory, I think he's a real rival for Max Field. And in my opinion, they should be similar prices here. And if Sonneman is 3 times the price of Max Field, I'd be inclined to take a shot with him.
Yeah, I have no problem with that. I mean, and as you say, Maxfield, he's not going to be 8-5. I mean, that's kind of a joke. I think he's almost sure to be 4-5. It's just a matter of how much the public gravitates to the other horses. Will they really zero in on Sonneman, or will it be a little more spread out? So as we've seen, we talk about a lot of these races. We don't know the odds ahead of time, and you got to be on your toes because you just never really know. We think we know a lot of times what the public's going to do, but it usually turns out we don't.
And I do just want to mention, you brought up Cool Bobby, and I think he is a horse that you have to have an opinion about, because it's not just that he's a horse that's on the lead with a speed favoring pace projector. I mean, he's a speed horse in a race where everybody else is literally a closer. So I think that makes him a horse you just have to consider based on that, because it's not like he's a horse that doesn't belong in this race. I mean, he's run some prior races against Allowance Company that at least give him a shot to hit the board. And if the pace is so much in his favor, I guess there's a shot that he could hang around for quite a while. I'm not going to pick him in this race because I think his pace advantage is just so obvious. He's got to take some money based on that. But I also am not completely against him. If I'm playing exotics, I think he's a horse you have to use underneath.
Yeah, and he's one of those horses. I think we have talked about this kind of thing before. He does have that speed edge you talk about. I really don't want to see James Graham come out and going 49-3 to the half. This is the kind you want to see. Let him run and make the others work to keep in contact, and then see if they can catch you. Because if you go too slow, you're just going to bring the closers that much closer to you, and they're going to outkick you late. So it will be interesting to see the ride. But this is the kind of horse I really like to see ridden aggressively and show what he has.
Yeah, we don't want to see a repeat of last Sunday's Bay Ridge at Aqueduct. That was quite an eyesore. Let's move on to Gulfstream Park, where they're running a couple of stakes races on Saturday. One graded stakes, the very interesting Mr. Prospector. We'll get to that in a little bit, but let's start with the 9th race on their card. That's the Via Borghese going 1 mile and 3/16 on the turf. This one's for the fillies and mares, and seems like a fairly competitive field. The morning line favorite is Always Shopping. I'm not sure that I quite see her as the favorite in this race, or really as much of a contender from my perspective. But you got a couple of horses from powerful stables like Christophe Clement and Chad Brown, who I think are going to be pretty tough in here. One of those is Traipsing, who has early speed, and also the number 9 Great Island for Chad Brown, who's moving up out of Allowance Company. Seems like she has plenty of upside.
Yeah, she does. I don't really have too much problem with Always Shopping, just because she, comes out of a couple good looking races on the running lines. Her speed figure 2 back would make her a strong contender in here. The last race where she barely lost at Keeneland was at 1.5 miles, and I think it was a really long run up that day, so it was probably closer to another half furlong or whatever. So I'm not going to hold that one against her too much. But at a short price from the outside, I don't particularly love her in here at all. Great Island is the Chad Brown horse just to her outside, who looks like she's going to take money. But for me, she hasn't run. She has 2 wins. So, I mean, we can't say she's done a whole lot wrong. But her speed figures are nothing for me to get too excited about. So I wanted to look in some other directions. I started out with Traipsing, who had set the pace in that much longer Long Island. Held on pretty well. But, her speed figures have been moving in the right direction. She's one that I definitely considered. But for my top pick, I actually went in a totally different direction, and I wound up going with Kelsey's Cross, which might seem a little bit funny because she actually lost pretty easily to Always Shopping last time. But I like the way her figures were moving. I liked her last race at Gulfstream. I don't think she showed us all she had. She didn't break well that day. She was wide on the turn, and she was still finishing strong. She's had some time off, and I was just looking for an alternative in here. I don't love the connections, to be honest, but that's why I'm demanding a price. I would have to have her at least the 10-1 she'll be on the morning, that she is on the morning line. But I think I'm going to get that, and I'm just looking for a horse who's going to be finishing, and I think she's the one.
Yeah, I guess I'm somewhat against Always Shopping in here because I don't really buy that speed figure that we gave her 2 back in that September stakes race. It just, for me, it's a number that just kind of looks 10 points too high for everybody in that field. So I'm just not. And visually watching the race, I thought Always Shopping got a pretty good trip and had to work hard to run down an inferior horse. So I don't know. I've just never been a fan of Always Shopping. I don't really get her at all in this race. She's coming out of a graded stakes race at Keeneland that she barely lost, but that was a grade 3. That was probably more like an allowance race. So I don't know. She just doesn't do much for me in here at all. And I agree with you coming out of that race that Always Shopping won 2 back. Kelsey's Cross is probably the horse that you do want if you want anybody out of there, because I didn't love the ride she got. She was towards the back of the pack. She made this 5 wide run around the far turn. Her rider let her drift out into the center of the track, even wider than she had to go at the quarter pole. And she ran on decently at the end. She's handled some longer distances in the past. So I think Kelsey's Cross, if she's a price in this race, she's one that I could be talked into. But I mean, I think the horses from the Clement and Chad Brown barns are going to be tough. Traipsing, she got a great trip last time in that Long Island, stretching out to the 1.5 miles. There was another speed horse in that race, Theodora B, who you would have thought would have pressured her on the front end, but for some reason she was rated, and it kind of left Traipsing as the lone speed in that race. So she had a very favorable pace setup. But that said, I mean, she still ran pretty well, and Muda Makina, who beat her, seems like a decent filly. So based on that performance, and even her prior allowance victory, it just seems like Christophe Clement has her headed in the right direction. And Great Island, she's never faced horses like this, but I don't think Chad Brown necessarily knew that this race wasn't going to come up the toughest stakes in the world, and he's stepping her right up into a stakes out of that N1X allowance victory. So I think that's always a good sign with Chad, and she's certainly bred to get more ground as a daughter of Scat Daddy, and her dam is a half-sister to Point of Entry, who obviously was best going 1.5 miles on the turf. So there is reason to believe that she'll appreciate the extra furlong she gets here, and she's just a horse to me that has always had a great deal of ability. The only time that she hasn't finished first in a race was to Mean Mary, who would obviously be about 2-5 against this field. So I just think Great Island is a filly that she's obvious, but she makes a lot of sense to me. So I'll primarily focus on those 2. And one other horse that I would throw into the mix at a price is the number 4, Captacreus. She's not a winning type, and don't get me wrong, I'm not saying she's my top pick in this race, but I think she's run well against some decent fields in her recent starts, and she always seems to get a piece of these races. So if I'm playing exotics, I would use her underneath in exactas and trifectas.
Yeah, the only thing I want to add to this race for the people listening is we all know the Gulfstream turf course. They use just a ton of rail settings and run-ups, and they do provide that information on their website. You got to dig around for it a little bit, but there is a place where they show the turf run-ups, and this race is going to be run at the rail with the rail at 96 feet and a short run-up of just 19 feet. So those things do matter, especially how it relates to post position. Just something for people to keep in mind when you're handicapping this race is the information is available out there from Gulfstream, and it may affect how you pick these things a little bit.
That is good information as always. Let's move on to the final race we're going to discuss on this podcast. That is the 10th, the Mr. Prospector Grade 3 event going 7 furlongs. And it's a large competitive field signed on here with a lot of quality. We've got some horses that are dropping out of the Breeders' Cup Sprint. And that group is led by Firenze Fire, who was third in that race. This horse was scheduled to run in the Cigar Mile a couple of weeks ago, but obviously with the track coming up as sloppy as it did, his connections have observed how poorly he ran over wet tracks other times this year, so they scratched him out of that race. He's targeting this one instead, and based on his recent form and class lines, he probably is the horse to beat, but this is arguably a tougher spot than he was going to encounter in the Cigar Mile.
Yeah, it could be. This is a pretty tough race, and as a speed figure guy, that just was not the strongest Breeders' Cup Sprint we're ever going to see. I mean, it could very well be one of the weakest. I haven't went back to look at it, but it just wasn't a strong field. It was a great story with Whitmore winning, but it just wasn't a particularly fast race. So for me, I'm going to play against those horses coming out of there, and Firenze Fire and Diamond Oops, because they just weren't running all that fast before the Breeders' Cup. They didn't run all that fast in it, and there's only been a couple runbacks from it, but nothing to get me too excited and think that it was a blown figure and it was really a much faster race. So I'm going to look in a different direction. And the horse I landed on is my old buddy Sleepy Eyes Todd, who was second at a huge price in the Oklahoma Derby. But he's just run really well since then. When he finds the right spots, he tends to run well. And what I really liked is how he ran in his last race at Keeneland, where he was able to come from way behind. Now, unfortunately, there was an incident in that race. The replay isn't available, but I do think he had some trouble. I have no idea how he won that race, to be honest. I thought it was just amazing watching visually. Now, the figure only came back a 111, which puts him a little bit below some of the favorites in here. But he had consistently run in the upper teens. He's hitting the 120s before. And I just think he's a horse who showed his form that day was as good as it's ever been. I'm not going to put a whole lot of stock in the speed figure. And I'm looking for a big race from him.
I have no problem with that horse. I agree. He ran well last time with a different running style than we've ever seen from him before, and Joel Rosario has a tendency to do that sometimes. He'll make some perplexing decisions, but it often works out, and he's able to get these horses to settle farther off the pace than they're used to. But I wouldn't be surprised if they ride him more like they have in prior races, up close to the pace, and I think that would be a wise decision here, because for a sprint race and a graded stakes sprint race with 12 horses, there's not a ton of front-running speed signed on, and the horses that are projected to be on the lead in the pace projector, they're massive long shots. Winds of Change and Zendin, they're not really contenders in this race, and maybe it falls apart because they're not expected to go all the way, but just looking through this field, I don't think this is the kind of race where I'd want to be picking a horse that has to come from far off the pace, and at least Sleepy Eyes Todd has that versatility where he can be placed close to the early pace. So I would definitely use him. Firenze Fire, I'm hardly against him in here. I just think it's a competitive spot, and as you said, his speed figures are just okay. They're not what they once were for Jason Service, and he fits well in here, but as the favorite, I thought there were other ways to go. Diamond Oops makes a ton of sense. He didn't run that well in the Breeders' Cup Sprint last time, but his prior form is great, and he showed that versatility where he could get a stalking trip too back in the Phoenix. So I think he's a horse that you have to use in here as well. But again, he'll be one that's a relatively short price. One horse that interested me quite a bit, who will be a price in this race, is the number 2 Cool Arrow. He's a Gulfstream specialist that competed here all summer and into the fall and earned some speed figures that they're maybe a cut below some of the top runners in here, some of the classier runners. But I thought he ran well in some of those races and was clearly in good form throughout the summer. And they tried an optional claiming race at Keeneland last time where he ran into Bon Raison and Manny Was and classy horses. And he set the pace there, but it kind of fell apart late. He got pushed down to the rail at the end, didn't really finish it off. But he is a horse that at least has the tactical speed to get the right trip in here. And I think he's the one that might get first run on those two long shots that are projected to be up front in the pace projector. And I could see him coming to the 8th pole with the lead in this race. And maybe if some horses like Sleepy Eyes Todd are too far back, or if High Call is too much left to do, or a horse like Diamond Oops isn't ridden forwardly in this race, maybe he just gets the right trip in here and wins as perhaps not the best horse in the race, but one that just works out the right trip.
Yeah, the other couple horses I wanted to mention, High Cow is one. He's run well off a layoff a few times in his career. Still pretty lightly raced for a 4-year-old. So I'm looking for a big race from him. Now, he does need things to go his way, as you say. So I would need every bit of that 6-1. But the other horse I was going to mention is the one you kind of dismissed, is Wind of Change. And that's just because I think it's very possible he gets an easy lead in here. His best race came at 7 furlongs, albeit at Charlestown, where it's a 2-turn race and definitely a little bit different. But it could very well be that a horse that goes as fast as he does early and gets tired at longer distances could just be 7 furlongs, could just be his distance. So at 30-1, a horse who I think is going to lead the race early, I'll have a few bucks on him as well.
I'm not going to knock that pick. I mean, he's run well at Gulfstream Park before, going a mile, so it stands to reason that he could do it going 7 furlongs. And as you said, he'll be in front. I mean, he's the one that has just the most early speed of any of these. It's just a matter of how far he can take them. But it's a very interesting race because I think there's a lot going on beyond those classy favorites that have competed in graded stakes throughout the year. I think this race is open to a lot of horses. Well, that's all the handicapping for this week. We'll be back to discuss these races in retrospect when we do the TimeformUS Pacecast next week. We'll, I assume, squeeze that in before the Christmas holiday. So we won't do the TimeformUS Forecast next week because that falls right on Christmas. But hopefully we make some scores this week, gave out some good ideas, and we'll recap how we do on the TimeformUS Pacecast when we record that on Tuesday. So remember, you can always listen to us on DRF.com, Spotify, iTunes, YouTube, and SoundCloud. Wherever you get your podcast, just make sure to subscribe to the Daily Racing Form channel. Thanks for listening this week, and stay tuned for that TimeformUS Pacecast on Tuesday.